My name is Daniel Simon. I'm the editor-in-chief of World Literature Today here at the University of Oklahoma. Welcome back to day one of the 2023 Neustadt Lit Fest. And as we were talking earlier, it's really been a pleasure for me to work with all 11 of the NSK Prize laureates over the years, beginning with Mildred D. Taylor in 2003.
Recording in progress.
And with the many brilliant teachers, librarians, professors, and students from OU, the Norman Public Schools, Colorado Academy, and other schools who have taken part in our Lit Fest over the past 20 years. They've really just blossomed. Today I'm honored to introduce the conversation event with Jean Yang and Trung Le Nguyen, and we'll moderate the audience Q&A at the end of the half hour. We'll try to wrap up around 12:15, time permitting. You've already met Jean Yang, our 2023 NSK laureate. Trung Le Nguyen is an award-winning Vietnamese-American artist, cartoonist, and writer from Minneapolis, Minnesota. His latest book project is called Marvel's Love Unlimited, Karma and Love, which he wrote and drew. You can read all about him in the program, and also you can get their books outside. Don't forget to check out Green Feather Bookstore today and throughout the Lit Fest. Tomorrow night you'll have the opportunity to get books signed as well by our marquee rock star writers and other writers who will be on campus participating, even our scholars from OU. So I will turn it over for now to our two marquee writers, Jean Yang and Trung Le Nguyen.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm really excited to be able to chat with Jean about a number of things. We're going to keep this conversation pretty focused on the literary end of things, which I'm kind of glad that I prepared for in advance because I didn't realize that we were going to cover so much in your conversation with Kelvin. So we're going to dive into just the book end of things. So if you're into comics, if you're into publishing, this is going to be where we'll primarily center this conversation. Now, before we kind of dive into the questions, I'm going to prepare you for gushing a little bit, so please don't be super embarrassed. So one of the things that always frustrates me about discussions about diversity in literature and in media in general is that there's this emphasis on seeing yourself reflected in media as sort of a shortcut to empathy, and that's never really been my problem, right? I grew up watching a lot of rom-coms. I like Nora Ephron movies, and I have never had any trouble empathizing with Meg Ryan in a situation, right? And we're obviously very different people. But reading American-Born Chinese when I was in high school, it came out in 2006, and I read it, I think, in 2007 for the very first time. Something clicked in my brain where I was like, I don't necessarily need to be reflected in media for me to empathize, but your book kind of made me understand that it is reasonable for me to ask other people to empathize with my story. And so I am so happy that you're here, and I'm really excited to be able to advocate for your book for NSK.
Yeah, thank you, Trung. It's an honor. It's an honor to be here, and I know it all began with your nomination. So I am incredibly grateful that you did that. Thank you.
So based on the questions that we've gotten in the last session, I understand that you're all smart people, so I'm very excited about this because I ran my questions by Jean a couple days ago, and Jean very politely sort of implied that I'm kind of a nerd. So
Do you disagree, though?
No, but I was like, man, you make comic books. We're in this together here. And so I come from an art history background, and I am fascinated with the ways that you use images as a part of the text in your book. And I talk about this a lot whenever I give lectures about how you sort of marry different visual literacies. And I don't know if this is something that you're doing with intention kind of on purpose, or if this is sort of just native to your process. But we touched on the sort of difficult parts of the text in terms of translating it to the screen. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about what your history is with yellow peril iconography, the imagery where the cousin character comes from, and how did you go about sensitively addressing the ways that you've chosen to interface with that sort of visual iconography.
So yellow peril is it's an archetype in Western literature, right? It's a archetype of an Eastern super genius who's bent on taking over the Western world or doing some kind of harm to the Western world. And I think as a kid, even before I knew what the phrase yellow peril meant, it was a part of my life. I'll give you an example. When I was a kid, I was a huge comic book nerd. I started collecting comics when I was in the 5th grade, and I would go to my local comic shop, and I was especially a Marvel fan, you know? Like, there are two big superhero companies in America, Marvel and DC. For whatever reason, when I was a kid, I thought Marvel was way cooler than DC. So anything with that Marvel logo on it, I would gravitate towards, except for one. Anytime I encountered Shang-Chi, you know, Marvel's kung fu superhero, I would avoid him like the plague. And I think the reason why I avoided him was because I had internalized that image of people who look like me as dangerous or embarrassing figures, you know. So even though Shang-Chi himself was being sold as a hero, his villain, like the villain that he faced in those early Shang-Chi comics, was Fu Manchu, who is like the granddaddy of all Yellow Peril villains. And I think there's just something very uncomfortable about that. So with American Born Chinese and bringing some of that imagery into American Born Chinese, it felt like it was something that I was just pulling from my own childhood. You know, I didn't necessarily have to research it. I did a little bit of research. I looked into early American political cartoons, especially around the 1800s, when America saw a huge influx of Chinese immigrant workers. So there was a lot of Yellow Peril imagery then. But really, like, pulling from my own childhood was pulling out all of that iconography.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, it's one of those things where I feel like if you write a story that kind of pulls from your own life in a specific way, the research part is sort of, that load is lightened a little bit.
Yeah, that's right. You've lived the research.
Mm-hmm.
You've lived the research.
For sure.
Yeah.
What were those editorial conversations like? I don't remember which editor you were working with at first second when you made American Born Chinese, but how did your editors interface with this kind of specific Chinese-American history of trauma?
Yeah, so the editor for American Born Chinese, and really for all of my books that I've gone through First Second. So First Second Books is an imprint of Macmillan, one of the big global publishers. And First Second is like, it began in 2006. So I was a part of their second season of publishing. I had actually finished 8 out of the 9 chapters of American Born Chinese before I submitted it to Mark. And because of that, I think from his perspective, it was more like, should I publish this or not? We didn't really talk a ton about the content, right? Because the content was like 85, 90% done. And much to his credit, I think he kind of gave me the freedom to do what I wanted. I only got one real note from him, and it was for this one panel where the cousin character, you know, the Yellow Peril character, was drooling, and he was like, can we do like less drool? So I edited it so that it would be less drool.
That's wonderful to hear that he really trusted your storytelling chops.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic.
I think, you know, now that I've gotten to work with both First Second and with like Marvel and DC, there's a big difference, you know, between those two different ways. You've done it too, right? Yes. So in my experience, when I get a note from Mark or anyone on the First Second side, it's kind of like a suggestion. It's like the beginning of a conversation. Whereas if I get a note from the DC or Marvel side, it's a directive. Yeah, you know, isn't that an invitation to discussion usually? Like 90% of the time, it's just not. It's not a suggestion.
You're playing with someone else's toys. You have to play by their rules, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and you're also writing stories in a larger universe, right? Mm-hmm. So if something happens in Batman, it might affect your book.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Is that a consideration that you actually had to do with DC Comics?
Oh, yeah,
because
all
Marvel
the time.
Was much more. Okay,
really? So Marvel was self-contained for you?
Yeah, Marvel was weirdly self-contained, which should be the opposite, because so the big difference between DC Comics and Marvel Comics, for those of you who aren't super into the continuity of the comics is that DC will reset their timeline. And so it's
That's
easier
right.
to have self-contained stories at DC, whereas Marvel will slide their time scale ever since, so all of the characters, like ever since the very beginning of Marvel, like are still young people today. Like
That's right.
the characters who lived during the Vietnam War are still 20-somethings in Marvel.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, I found, I guess, so for Marvel, I did a 24-issue run on Shang-Chi. And in some ways, it was self-contained. You know, I did have crossovers with some of the major superheroes. But that's true. For Marvel, I don't remember like a cataclysmic event happening in somebody else's book affecting what was happening in Shang-Chi. But in DC, it happened all the time.
Mm-hmm.
In DC, I was like, I did this book called Terrifics, which is like the DC version of Fantastic Four. It's about 4 heroes. One of them kind of looks like he's made of rocks. One of them is stretchy. One of them is a super genius. One of them is a young woman who can turn invisible. And we had this one storyline where Blue Beetle guest starred. So the Jamie Reyes Blue Beetle, for those of you who are nerds, you know, the Blue Beetle that just showed up in the last movie. And then it was supposed to be a 6-issue story. 3 issues in, my editor called me up and goes, "Oh, Blue Beetle got turned into a zombie in Batman, so we need you to write him out." So I had to do that. I just had to write him out. That kind of stuff happens all the time when you're working in a shared universe like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's always a weird frustration. I mean, I've only gotten one note from DC where that happened, and I was working on, with another writer, a Pride issue, because they do those anthologies, and I included Selena Kyle, the Catwoman character, because she's bisexual. But because the Batman movie was coming out, they didn't want discourse around it, and so they asked me to remove her.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
That's rough. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, comics is messy.
That's a rough note.
Yeah.
That's a rough note.
Okay, so now getting back to American-born Chinese, there are a lot of really wonderful kind of personal touches to your relationship to both Chinese legends and to the visual iconography of Catholicism, which I find really fascinating because we're both parochially educated. Catholicism is a huge part of both of our lives. And there are points wherein Chinese mythology and religion and the goddess of mercy touch the nativity and kind of the iconography between Catholicism and that sort of spiritual tradition kind of converge. How did that come about? And was that something that felt very natural to you? Was that something that you were delighted to include? Tell me more about that.
Well, I grew up in a Chinese Catholic home. I went to a Chinese Catholic church growing up. And early on, it seemed to me like Chinese culture and Catholicism just kind of went hand in hand, because it seemed like every time somebody was talking about like Jesus in my life, they were doing it in Chinese, you know? And it wasn't until I became an adult that I realized that, first, historically, that's not true. And second, even in our modern world, there actually is a lot of tension between these two ways of looking at the world, between this very Western way of looking at the world that's embodied by Catholicism, which is like this deeply Western institution, and traditional Chinese, like Confucian-based culture. There's overlap, but then there's also places in which they hold each other in tension. And I think a lot of the tension that I feel in my life is sort of embodied by that relationship, embodied by the relationship between the Catholic Church and Chinese culture. So I'm still a practicing Catholic, although now I go to a Korean American community. So I'm married to a Korean American, and we go to the church that she grew up in. And even now, I think you can see it, even within this Korean context, you can see these tensions. And I think like story comes from tension. Story comes from conflict. Like when you're sifting through your own life for story ideas, the places that are the most fruitful are often the parts of your life that produce the most negative emotion, So I mean, in some ways, I think that I like that. Like I want that tension. So it's not always fun, but it does often feel fruitful to have that tension in my life.
Yeah, oh, that's really wonderful. And it kind of comes together in a really beautiful way in Boxers and Saints, which is not the center of this conversation, but if you have an opportunity to take a look at it, it's also available through Greenfeather out there. Boxers and Saints does a wonderful job of kind of exploring that tension from several different perspectives and histories, and from the Boxer Rebellion and like missionaries in China. Like that's something that I was not aware of in any kind of historical context, because my education did not kind of extend to those regions of the world. And on that note, I kind of was wondering if you ever felt, and oftentimes if you are a creator from any marginalized background, whenever you tell a story, people start expecting you to kind of be some sort of representative, like you're, there to edify the public about your experience, about this group of people that you happen to come from. Is that something that informs your work in any way? Is that a tension that you've had to contend with? What's your relationship to that? Because you're also an educator, and so I'm curious about how that affects the way that you approach that expectation.
Yeah, there is that, right? And I think it doesn't just happen for us as authors. It even happens with like fictional characters. I think it's less true now, but if you back up maybe 10 or 20 or 30 years, anytime a character shows up on a screen that is of a minority community, it's almost like that character has to represent the entire people group. That character can exist as an individual. And I did feel some of that, especially early on in my career. I think it did help that I hung out with a lot of other Asian American creators. So I felt like as a whole, our work kind of presented a more pluralistic view of what it meant to be Asian American. And now I think I'm seeing that all over. With work like yours, and there's a guy named Dan Santat, who is a Thai American creator, just got nominated for the National Book Award for his graphic novel. There's a bunch of folks now, like Sarah Myers is a Korean adoptee. Collectively, I think if there are more voices from a specific community telling stories, that particular pressure gets relieved, right? You realize that any individual book is just one facet of a much more complex communal experience.
Yeah, it's a striving for plenitude so that the stories aren't in danger of becoming the single story.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, oh, that's beautifully put. That's actually kind of encouraging to me to hear, actually. I've realized that I have no idea how to tell the time up here because I'm not about to pull out my phone. So if someone could give me a 10-minute warning, I want to make sure that I leave room for audience questions. Otherwise, we'll just keep talking forever. Oh, yes, of course. I brought up a bunch of, I pulled a bunch of images from your book so that people could get a notion about what your visual work looks like. And you've done a lot of writing where you don't draw the work as well. What is the thing that you miss about those two? Like, what's your relationship between each process? Do you prefer to draw your own work, or do you like collaborating with other artists?
I actually like both. I do like both. I have some books where I do both the writing and the drawing. Other books where I only handle the writing and somebody else does the drawing. I'm a very slow and limited artist. It takes me forever to draw, even though I have this very simplified style. And then I've also tried to draw in other styles, and it never works out. I just always default to this one style. So that one style is not appropriate for all of the stories I want to tell. So I have to partner with other artists, who are more flexible and faster than me. I would say that the difference between the two different ways of doing things is, one, if I'm in control of both the writing and the art, the story can be much more personal because I can have control over every single word and every single line on the page. But then if I work with somebody else, it becomes less personal, but it becomes this expression of a relationship, a friendship that I have with the other creator. And what comes out at the end is often different, like significantly different than what I originally imagined. So an example of that is my most recent graphic novel. It'll be out in January of next year. It's my very first rom-com. It's called Lunar Near Love Story. It's about two young people who fall in love on a lion dancing team. Lion, not lion. Lion. You know what lion dancing is? You know what lion dance? They do it at Lunar Near. They have these Yeah. So I partnered with Luen Pham. We're really good friends. We've been friends for a couple of decades. We've always talked about doing something together, and then now we're finally doing it together. It's been incredible. So there are aspects of that book that I can point to and be like, that I would not have been able to do that on my own, right? I needed help to do that. So an example of that is the friendship between the protagonist and her best friend. Lei Wen deeply influenced the writing of that friendship, right? Like, she read my very first draft and she was like, you have these two young women, they're high school kids, and they talk like 20-something guys. Like, this is not, yeah. In general, high school girls are not gonna punch each other in the shoulder, like stuff like that. She would tweak that. So there's just no way I could have done that on my own.
That's really wonderful. Now, whenever you're making a graphic novel, and you've done this several times, do you find that your process is pretty consistent, or do you find that with each project there are new challenges and you kind of have to relearn how to do certain things?
Yeah, what Kelvin described earlier, I find. Mm-hmm. Every single time I'm at the beginning of a project, I feel like I just don't know how to write. I forgot how to write, and I have to relearn it. So I end up reading a lot of craft books early on. And I feel like every project just seems like a completely different thing from what came before. It's almost like I have amnesia as a writer, and I just forget how to do all of it. I forget what a plot is, and I have to just relearn it all.
That's very reassuring to hear personally.
You feel that way too?
Yeah, no, because I finished my first graphic novel and I was like, okay, this is great, I know how to do this. And then I sat down and started my second one immediately, and I was like, I don't know how to do any of this. I don't know how I accomplished this thing, and so it's kind of reassuring to hear that. And I think every creative person goes through that, where you have to relearn every time you sit down. But it's a nice thing sometimes too. It keeps things fresh.
It's also annoying though.
It's very annoying, yeah. It's stressful.
Yeah. It's really stressful. I have a friend, his name is Brian McDonald. So he's a screenwriting coach, and he also writes graphic novels. He did an amazing book called The Land of the Dead, which is like a craft book. It examines the way in which different stories across different cultures are all structured, the commonalities between storytelling across the world. And he says that as you move forward as a writer, it gets harder and harder because your target actually gets smaller. Like, your understanding of what a good story is becomes more refined. So what you're aiming at gets smaller and smaller, and it just gets worse and worse. Which is not reassuring, but I also think it's kind of true, Yeah.
Now, whenever you're, in terms of kind of talking about your book, one of the things that nobody tells you when you make a book is that you continue to give book reports on your own book for the rest of your life after it's been published. You've answered probably a million questions about American-born Chinese, about Boxers and Saints, but have there ever been any questions that have sort of delighted or surprised you, that have enabled you to talk about things that you haven't been able to?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I appreciate most is, sometimes I'll do these talks about American-born Chinese at a library or at a school, and then afterwards, a young person will come up to me and they'll tell me about the commonalities between what's happening in the book and their own lives. And often they're not like me, right? They don't have parents that come from China or Taiwan, but often they'll be immigrant kids. They'll be like, their parents will come from Russia or Nigeria or some other part of the world, and all of the specifics are different, but then the underlying emotions are the same. And I think during those conversations, the questions that they ask me about my individual life and the questions I get to ask them about their lives kind of points out this common humanity that is very. It's sort of like a counterbalance to Twitter. Twitter makes me sad about the world, and those kind of conversations make me happy about the world.
Yeah, yes. And audience questions have always been such a wonderful part of being able to talk about your books. I'm super curious about so you did a book called Dragon Hoops, which I loved, and it's sort of autobiographical, but you also center the experiences of other people. And I also really love work by Mari Naomi, who is a memoirist and a fantastic cartoonist. And you have such different approaches to telling your own story and being personal and kind of mining your own life for experiences and expressing them. What was the challenge and the difference between writing something like Dragon Hoops, which is sort of lifted from your life in a very specific and literal way, and American-Born Chinese, which sort of fictionalizes things and makes it into metaphor?
Yeah, so American-Born Chinese is fiction, but I pulled pretty heavily from my own life to tell that story, especially my junior high and high school years, because I think for whatever reason, junior high tends to bring out the jerk in people, so a lot of the tension that we find in ourselves as adults often is rooted in those years of our lives. For Dragon Hoops, it is explicitly autobiographical, although I'm not the main character. Dragon Hoops is a graphic novel that was released in 2020, and it's about a high school basketball team. So I followed this team in Oakland for a season, the Bishop O'Dowd Dragons. I was not a basketball fan before I started that book. If you had told me 10 years ago that I would spend 5 years of my life writing about basketball, I would not have believed you, because I kind of hated the sport. I hated it because I was really bad at it as a kid, and the court was kind of like this arena of humiliation for me, So to spend like 5 years in this arena of humiliation, I would not have believed. I think the big difference is you can't change things, when you're writing autobiography. So especially with the players, when I would interview them, I would have to present what they said exactly as they said it. And then I would go to these basketball games, and whatever happened on the court, I tried my best to replicate in the book. And often, what happened on the court did not fit what I wanted to happen. Like for my plot, it would have been better if they had lost this particular game and won the next game. And that just, sometimes that's not how life played out, Whereas with American-Born Chinese, I could structure things, I could change things so that the plot worked exactly how I wanted it to. Yeah, it's all about control, I think. That's the difference.
Yeah, for sure, because it becomes a process of sort of curating a little bit.
That's
and
right.
so you're
That's
always
right.
sort of presenting as much of the truth as you can, but it's a facet of it. Did you feel any sense of weight and responsibility in also carrying other people's stories? Because that's sort of the trouble with autobiographies.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't know if I'm ever going to do that again. I don't know if I'm ever going to write about real people again like that. At least I think I might do another book about real people, but they all have to be dead. You know what I mean? Because the pressure is relieved if they're all dead. Yeah.
Yes.
But
grave robbing stories is a lot easier than interviewing people in real life.
Yes, that's right. But for Dragon Hoops, like the coaches were not just. I mean, there were people in my actual life who I wanted to remain friends with. So we would there would be these complicated situations, and I have to figure out how to present it in a way that kind of honored them and also honored the truth as I found it. So I do, like one of the ways I dealt with that was I tried to weave that discussion into the narrative itself, But there was a lot of pressure. Like I ended up having conversations with my agent, who directed me to have conversations with a lawyer, and it was like the most complicated book I've worked on so far from that perspective. Like I had to have conversations about laws that I have no idea about,
Yeah, okay, that's good to know. I'm going to put off anything autobiographical for a long time. So I think we only have time for one more of my questions before we turn it over to the audience. So I'm a huge fairy tale nerd. I love folklore and I love oral tradition, and I like looking into the ways that those stories are structured. Especially within American-Born Chinese, what is and what was your relationship to Chinese mythology and Chinese legend and stories, and how did you come about incorporating that into the graphic novel in the way that you did?
Yeah, I think Chinese legend just reminds me of my mom, and maybe my family in general. So as a kid, every night at bedtime, my mom would tell me stories. She would often tell me stories about the Monkey King, who was this really, really famous Chinese legendary figure. And when I think about Chinese legends, I often hear the stories in her voice. I actually think, in a lot of ways, my relationship with Chinese culture in general is all kind of, it's like when you hear things only in echoes. That's kind of how it feels like to me, right? Like I got to visit China for the very first time in around the year 2001, I think, as an adult. And walking around, it was like everything was familiar but not familiar to me. It was almost like I'd visited this place in a dream, and and being able to touch something just felt very surreal. It felt like I was touching something that I never had direct experience of, but was still super, super familiar to me. So with Chinese fairy tales, it reminds me, like I love them because they remind me of my childhood, but they also remind me of that disconnection, the fact that I've never had any direct experience of that.
And especially with oral tradition stories, if you grew up in an immigrant household, oftentimes, your child self speaks a different language than your adult self.
That's right.
And so that tension becomes exacerbated through that.
Yeah,
so those echoes become fainter. It's really strange.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for answering my very nosy questions. I deviated a lot from the list of questions that I sent you, and you're such a sport about it. We're going to turn it over to the audience now. So if you have any questions for Jean, please raise your hands.
Testing, here we go.
Hi, I wanted to ask, when and how did you know that this is something that you wanted to do, like for the rest of your life?
Oh, when did I know that I wanted to do it from the rest of my life? I've always loved comic books and animation. And my dream very early on in my life was to work for Walt Disney. I wanted to become a Disney animator. So I used to draw in the classic Disney style. I'd practice over and over again. I would go to the library and I would check out as many books about Walt Disney as I could find. I used to even have a poster-sized head shot of him over my bed. Like I was very obsessed with Walt Disney, you know. Yeah. My friends would come over. They'd be like, "Why do you have a picture of a creepy old man in your bedroom?" And I have to be like, "That is not just any creepy old man. That is Walt Disney." I really wanted to be a Disney animator. And that changed when I was in high school. When I was in 5th grade and I bought my very first comic book, you know. But even after that, the tension was always between animation and comics. But then as an adult, I went to comic book conventions in the 90s, and the comic book industry back then was not what it is now. So in the 90s, Marvel had declared bankruptcy, and people were expecting it to kind of disappear. And if Marvel disappeared, it would have taken most of the comic book shops in America with it. So the entire industry was in danger of collapsing. That's how I entered. And when you're in an environment like that, you're like, I'm never gonna make a living at this, but I still love it, so I'm gonna do it. My plan for my life at that point was I was gonna have another job to feed myself, and then I was gonna make comics because I loved it. I thought some people waste time and money on golf. I'm gonna use my time and money on comics, you know? So if you're talking about the comics as an art, I knew very early on that I wanted to do it. If you're talking about comics as a living, that came much later. That came I was doing comics maybe 10 or 15 years before I decided it's what I wanted to do for a living.
Question from way in the back.
I just wanted to say I relate to a lot of what you said about going back to like China, where it's like you feel a lot of cultural ownership, but you also just feel like you fit in, but you also feel really just stupid.
Yeah.
I had a question about writing Shang-Chi. So with a lot of those like kind of legacy characters, they have a lot of history, and with that history, you kind of get the chance to retcon things. Was there something on the top of your list that you're like, I have the opportunity to fix something in Shang-Chi. This is the first thing I'm going to fix.
Yeah. But I totally hear you about China. When I went to China, I would speak in Chinese to people, and like vendors or my tour guide, and they'd be like, "Why do you speak so badly?" And then I would be like, "I grew up in America," and they'd be like, "Oh, you speak really well." So I totally get that. With Shang-Chi, I got to do 24 issues. At the top of my list, so I started that book, and I read all of these Shang-Chi comics that I had avoided as a kid, and I realized I'm kind of glad I avoided them because there's just a lot of rough stuff in there. And at the top of my list was I wanted to change the way Shang-Chi spoke. Because in those early Shang-Chi comics, he kind of sounds like a fortune cookie anytime he says something. So I wanted to change that. The second thing I wanted to change was I had actually proposed to radically change his relationship with his father. So in the original comics, his father was Fu Manchu. And then after Marvel lost the license to Fu Manchu, they changed his name Zhang Zhu, and I wanted to radically change that relationship. I wanted to make it so that Zhang Zhu was more of a mentor to Shang-Chi, almost like a Hannibal Lecter, so he was like evil Sheen, but kind of good, but evil Sheen, but helping Shang-Chi do something good. But Marvel was not into that idea. And part of the reason why Marvel was not into that idea was because of what Trung just talked about, how the DC universe will reboot from time to time, but Marvel, everything is in continuity from the very beginning. So you can't deviate too much from the original structure of the relationships. But in the end, I do think that we were able to add complexity to the relationship, because what we did in the final issue that I wrote for them was we had Shang-Chi go back in time, because you can do that in the Marvel Universe, and meet his dad when his dad was much younger, and realize that at the very beginning of his career, at least, his dad had a lot of ideals that he was trying to live out.
Question from the middle.
Hi, I have a question about American-Born Chinese. Did the story of American-Born Chinese stay consistent during the different drafts, or did it change a lot while you were writing it?
So with American-Born Chinese, I thought about it for a very long time, and it began actually as 3 different story ideas, and eventually I came up with the idea of taking these 3 different story ideas and kind of weaving them together as a single story, right, as a single narrative. Once I hit on that and I wrote the outline, the big pieces of the story all kind of stayed the same. That was very, very early on in the process. I saw a young man right here.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll come around.
So I wanted to ask what some good startup gigs are, because I've wanted to write and like draw my whole life, but I just don't know where you start with that. That just seems like the biggest, scariest part of it. Like, where do you start? How do you get a gig that pays, lets you eat, lets you do all that, fun stuff?
Yeah, so how do you start writing? That's what you're asking.
Yeah.
How do you start writing and how do you start drawing? I personally think the blank screen or the blank page can be one of the scariest things in the world. And my hack for that is I trick my brain into thinking what I'm writing doesn't matter. Sometimes people refer to this as the garbage draft, like you try to purposely write something bad, and then in the process of writing that, your engine kind of gets going and you can move on. The way I trick my brain into thinking that what I'm writing doesn't matter is when I was around your age, I would start every story on napkins, because napkins feel like you can throw them away, right? And I would just write on napkins in cafes. And then eventually on the computer, I would write on Notebook. You know what Notepad on a Windows machine. You know what that is? It's like this old app. And it's so old that it doesn't auto-save, so if your computer somehow turns off, you lose everything you write. That was like the digital version of a napkin, And I think you just have to do something like that. You have to do something that tricks your brain into thinking what you're writing is unimportant, and then once your juices get going, the good stuff will come out.
And as Kelvin was saying, when the muse taps you on the shoulder, you better be at your desk.
That's right. When the muse taps you at your shoulder, you better be at your desk. That's right.
Or when your teacher taps you on the shoulder, walk through that door that they open for you. So, one more question.
This could be for either of you. I regularly teach graphic novels as part of literature classes, and I'm always surprised how many young students still don't regularly read graphic novels and comics. And there's often a dismissive attitude that, oh, this person's really interested in visual art and the story comes second. Or, that the words are just kind of there to move the story with images. But clearly you both think about language and visual language as necessary for storytelling. So I was wondering if you could talk about the relationship between the visuals and the words in your creative process for storytelling.
You want to start this one?
Sure, I'll go first. So I don't come from a cartooning background. I come from an art history background. And so my relationship to words as and pictures as a text together is a little bit different, and so I'm schooled a little bit differently. And so the way that I think about narrative has a lot to do with relationships between iconography, and one of the things that I always find really fascinating about graphic novels and about comic books in general is that when you think about the grammar, usually when I'm talking to like grad level students, I'll use the word orthography, which is like what the rules are about how you glean meaning from one symbol to another. And whenever I'm talking to reluctant readers of comics, or if ever I need to feel like, if I need to evangelize about the quality of comics, I often talk about the distinction between an illustrated book and a graphic novel or a comic book. And in illustrated books, the images are there to sort of support the words, which are the actual text, but the images are not necessarily a part of the text. They sometimes help provide context, and of course, because it's an art form, there's a lot of fluidity between whether or not it can be considered a text or not. And some illustrated books are quite close to comic books, and I think that a lot of them do cross over. But comics are unique in that the pictures are the text as much as the words are, and being able to communicate and access someone's sense of visual literacy is something that's very important in today's world with media changing over so much. Being able to articulate and react to and be critical of visual media becomes very, very important. And so, you know, if you can find a succinct way to talk about that, the next time someone has questions about the validity of comics as literature, or even encouraging them to read comics as a part of their sort of literary practice, that might be a good place to start.
I do think this, we do have a phobia of combining words and pictures here in America. And I think I have a pet theory that is rooted in the Reformation, actually. Because there are three major comic book cultures in the world. There's us, and then there's a European one that's centered around France and maybe French-speaking Belgium, and then there's a Japanese culture. And for both of those two other places, comics are produced for a variety of age demographics, about a variety of topics in a variety of genres, right? For us, America historically has been dominated by a single genre. It's been dominated by superheroes, and most comics, until very recently, were seen as quote unquote like boys' stories, you know, like teenage power fantasies for boys. That's kind of what it was seen as. Especially if you look at Asia, Asia has not had that phobia of combining text and images. Like if you look at traditional Japanese printmaking or traditional Chinese brush painting, the image is always paired up with text. And the work is not considered complete unless both of those things are there. And the work is not considered masterful unless both of those elements are masterful. You know, so when you're teaching how to communicate through both image and text, you're teaching a much more global way of communication, I would argue. So that's one thing I would say. The second more practical thing I would say is about that relationship between text and image. If you want to have language on how to talk about it, like for a paper, you know, in a sophisticated way, look at the work of Scott McCloud. So in his book, Understanding Comics, he lays out these different ways in which images and words can relate to each other. Like sometimes they contradict, sometimes they reinforce each other. And using his language, you can write up a pretty awesome paper about any comic.
I think we need to wrap, actually.
Just real quick. Sure. Any further theory about what historically is happening at this moment where we are trying to bring words and pictures back together? Because I don't have a lot of to draw on here, but I can remember in the Romantic period in Britain, William Blake, you know, there's a lot of interplay between pictures and words and so on. Does it have to do with overcoming the Puritanism of American culture? Pictures are, you know, sensual and so on. I mean, what's your theory about why now?
Why it's happening now? Yeah. I mean, this is just pulling stuff out of, you know, wherever, right? Like no research, we're just pulling stuff out. I do think maybe globalization has something to do with it. I think the current comic book market that we're seeing with the genre diversity and the diversity of voices that we're seeing is heavily influenced by this boom of manga and anime that kind of became mainstream in the early 2000s. And because Japanese culture never had that phobia of text and image, that ethos kind of influences the modern American readership.
I have a complementary theory, and I think it has a lot to do with changing technology as well. My focus in studying art history is ephemera from the turn of the century, and so the illustrations and images that I tended to look at accompanied texts all of the time. And at the time, printing presses were not advanced enough to print in color, and illustrators were painters, they were fine artists, and so they often occupied a different strata socially than a lot of illustrators and designers do now. And when books were printed in that day, they were prestige objects. They were gift books. And so they would have beautiful illustrations in full color printed on separate plates and then either glued or taped into the book. And then they would be presented as very, very expensive status symbol gifts. As technology sort of changed and we were able to incorporate printing and color printing of images into the written book form, that started to slowly change a little bit. Illustrators started to lose status in the kind of the middle of the century, in the 1950s and 60s. And so by today, illustrators like publishing houses don't have house illustrators in the same way. And so the ways in which illustrators and people who work in graphic media had to kind of find work in other avenues, and then they ended up being contracted more often than they would work for a single publisher for their entire life. So now we're seeing this boom and this sort of burgeoning relationship between comics as this sort of digital media and a lot of the streaming platforms that are coming in too. The ways that our industry has been changing, like especially in comic books, has been influenced a lot by film. And it was the same way in the 1950s as well. A lot of the visual standards of comic books, particularly the noir comic books that produced, superheroes like Batman, those were all based off of noir films that were available at the time. If you look at Dick Tracy comic books, the femme fatale characters are all based on Lauren Bacall in The Big Sleep. And so there is this relationship with culture that Jean mentioned, but it also has a lot to do with changing industry and technology.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's a wrap for this morning.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for your questions.